Visitations is a collection of meditative virtual reality vignettes. They're designed to improve the setting, as in set and setting, for patients undergoing ketamine infusion therapy, and was assembled for use in a study conducted by researchers at Manhattan Restorative Health Sciences in New York. It is an artwork which employs design strategies tailored to support therapeutic outcomes. These strategies include the use of artistic techniques which have measurable physiological effects, and user experience design decisions which take into account the specific needs of incapacitated patients. So set and setting is a concept that Timothy Leary came up with. He coined the term, and it basically refers to the idea that your expectations and your own state of mind and the place that you're in have a huge impact on the quality of the experience that you have when you're doing psychedelics. So I am David Lobser. My background is in animation and visual effects. I would also say applied design. I had a mid-career shift. I went to ITP at NYU in New York, and I learned how to be a developer. I fell in love with procedural design, and around the same time I was also introduced to medicine ceremonies and doing work in that space. I developed an app called Cosmic Sugar, which is sort of part of kind of under the same umbrella, and also, even though it wasn't designed as a therapeutic experience initially, it also has some therapeutic qualities, I think. I also worked on a project called Luxury Escapism with Tyler Pridgeon, who's here in the audience today, and we set up a digital spa in New York just before the pandemic, a year before the pandemic, and it was tailored to digital experiences designed to help you get into a more meditative state of mind. And then Visitations, the app, was released, actually I need to adjust that because it was released in 2020 actually. So this is an extra slide about luxury escapism. We basically wanted to build an art experience that mirrored the experience of going to a spa. So instead of steam rooms and cold dips and hot rooms and all of that stuff, you went into these different experiences that were inspired by oddly satisfying content and ASMR. In the lower left, that's an experience called Rainbow Therapy. It's a vibrating waterbed with a very intense strobe light and binaural beats on the headphones that you're using, and everything is adjustable. This is a trailer for the experience. The project was initially conceived of at the advent of this round of commercialized VR. I had a lot of experiments that I was making for myself as a way of exploring self-hypnosis and exploring procedural graphics, and I was seeking a way to package them together and share them with people, because on their own, each experience was not going to work as a standalone experience. So kind of wanted to make a festival or a gallery of these experiences for people. They were influenced by the goals that filmmakers in the 70s had, which had to do with exploring consciousness and creating films that kind of mirrored what consciousness is like on a moment-to-moment basis, as opposed to making narrative films. So Stan Brakhage, James Benning, Michael Snow, I love all of them. I had heard of Jordan Belson before, but it was only when I came to San Francisco recently that somebody reminded me of him, so I looked up his work a little bit, and it's very much in line with this kind of work. So he's San Francisco-based and basically invented planetarium laser light shows in the 50s and 60s in San Francisco. I was introduced to Melissa Sellinger, who introduced me to Tim Canty, who runs Manhattan Restorative Health Sciences, and we collaborated on putting this study together. So ketamine, if you're not familiar with it, it's similar to psychedelics, but it's in its own class. It would not be considered a classic psychedelic like LSD or mushrooms. It is a dissociative anesthetic. It creates a trance-like state, providing pain relief, sedation, and amnesia. Experiences can differ. Some people are averse to it. It can be strange and unusual, but people report having visionary experiences of new perspectives and emotions, including hope, optimism, and a sense of meaning. It's been around for a long time, but interest has grown recently because of its antidepressant effects and because of a growing psychedelic renaissance led by the works that MAPS is doing with MDMA. So the nice thing about ketamine is that it's been around for a long time, it's been demonstrated to be safe, it's legal, any doctor can prescribe it. It's Schedule 3, so it can be prescribed off-label. So actually most people who get ketamine infusions are not being prescribed it in the proper way. The only form of ketamine that is approved for depression right now, as far as I know, is Johnson & Johnson's S-ketamine, which is a nasal spray. And along with the substance, you also need to, they have a way of doing it. So there's a protocol that's built into the approval of the drug, which involves needing to sit with a therapist for 2 hours. So it's a 1-hour experience and a sort of 1-hour after experience. Very often, so everybody who's prescribing infusions, like everybody's kind of making up their own protocols, but typically it would look like 5 or 6 infusions over 2 to 3 weeks. Ketamine and VR have been combined before. In 2011, I believe it was. Hunter Hoffman did a study with a VR app called Snow World. It was basically for burn patients who are having their skin debrided, which is an incredibly painful experience. And what he did was put people in VR and showed them an experience of snow people throwing snowballs at them. So when the snowballs would hit them, that's when their skin would be scrubbed to get rid of the dead tissue. And part of the process was recontextualizing that experience of pain. You're getting hit by a snowball, instead of having your skin removed, it becomes much more enjoyable. So people actually rated this experience as being significantly more enjoyable than not being in VR. So for this study we did with Manhattan Restorative Health Sciences, there were 3 infusions in 1 week. The first infusion was done without VR, just on its own, which is the standard way of doing it. The second one was done with VR, and the third time around, patients could choose whether they wanted to be in VR or not. And more than 2/3 actually preferred the experience with VR. So it was well tolerated, and people enjoyed it. The alternative to being in VR was to either have an eye mask, people could bring their own music, but otherwise, if they were not in VR, they were in a fairly clinical space. It's a nice clinic, but it is a clinic. And the results are hopefully going to be published soon. So this is some of the feedback that we got. Not every subject had a preference for VR, but those that did were effusive. The feedback suggests that the VR experience didn't just provide a nicer place to be, but assisted in the therapeutic work. So this is just a little of the feedback we got, which my intuition was that we were going to get good feedback, but we got some very, very good feedback. So the goal of therapeutic art is not, to make an artistic statement. It's to create a space for other people to have experiences. It's also, should be designed in a way to elicit the body's natural healing responses. The placebo effect is an incredibly powerful thing. When they're designing antidepressants, they have to demonstrate that antidepressants are more effective than placebo, but it turns out the placebos are actually very effective antidepressants and effective for all kinds of other things too. So there is a quality of VR that can help lend to the placebo effect in addition to other things. So the patients that were involved in the study were a population that suffered from pain and depression. It's an orthopedic surgery clinic, so people were often there initially to have some kind of surgery done, and these follow-up appointments were to deal with not just the pain but also the depression that came along with it. They generally didn't have any experience with VR or very little experience with VR, and we didn't want to give them complicated tasks to do. We didn't want to give them controllers, we didn't want to make a game, we didn't want to do anything that was remotely complicated. So it's a very passive experience. All the scenes are really meant to be settings. The patients are set up in recliners, so they can recline as much as they want. A lot of VR experiences are, can reorient with in the y-axis, but most VR experiences don't let you recline necessarily. So that was an important part of the design for Visitations, is no matter which way you look, it will reorient in that direction. So you can be inverted, you can be lying down, reclining. They're all designed to reorient so you're looking at the thing that we want you to be looking at. So I already mentioned there's hardly any interaction. People are given a controller so they can pick scenes, but there's no menu. They click on the controller button and they can switch to the next scene until they find one that they like. There are 12 scenes total. For the app that was released, there is a gaze-based menu, so you can design your own set of experiences and choose from them, and it's made for people who aren't in that state. So these are, this is a non-exhaustive list of modalities we were thinking about when we were designing these experiences. The authors of the paper Designing Awe in Virtual Reality, an Experimental Study, describe awe as a complex emotion encompassing the two main appraisal themes of vastness, the perception of being in front of either perceptually or conceptually grand and vast stimuli, and need for accommodation, the urge to adjust mental frames according to new incoming information. So there's something called the overview effect, which you might have heard of, that astronauts experience when they blast off into space and see Earth, like all of Earth for the first time. They have this experience of just like awe and wonder because they have to, it's just like a completely new way of looking at the world, and that creates this sense of awe. I think that part of the joy of looking at fractals comes from a similar place. I would say that the feeling of awe arises because the mind's eye is drawn into nested infinities, effortlessly and playfully accommodating the unique role of each particular recursive form. The breath is the most commonly used object of meditation, but it can be hard to focus on in unpleasant or confusing situations. Scenes and visitations are designed to act as immersive and all-encompassing objects of meditation that grab attention for people with less meditation experience. Catharsis is a purging of negative emotions resulting in beneficial outcomes. Not all of the moods explored in visitations are exactly uplifting. Some are actually fairly heavy, which I believe allows people to immerse in more difficult emotions with the benefit of the distance of an aesthetic experience. I'm also very inspired by a musician named Phil Niblock, who creates like meditative tone compositions that are almost the same, like one tone for 30 minutes, but they're incredibly textural and they explore a lot of different ranges of emotions. They're not all the kinds of uplifting music that you might hear with new age sound baths or that kind of thing. I think there's a range of emotions that can be explored, and focusing on less positive emotions also has an important place. So with distraction therapy, VR draws a patient's focus away from wherever they are and leaves less concentration available to process incoming pain signals. So the idea is you have a certain amount of attention, and if you draw the attention away from the thing that's unpleasant, then you'll have less of that experience. So this is actually a really powerful thing about VR, VR on its own actually has analgesic effects. If you're in a painful situation, it's been shown again and again in a variety of studies that VR actually helps reduce the experience of pain. So entrainment refers to the frequency following effect that comes from exposure to auditory or visual beats, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the framing and context kind of gets to this idea of what they were doing with Snow World, where you're having an unpleasant experience or a challenging experience, and the idea is to create a space where you can look at it in a different way, recontextualize it. It helps immensely psychologically. So something I've been really curious about, and somebody just forwarded me some information about a fairly new study that came out of Helsinki. It's titled Restoration in a Virtual Reality Forest Environment, and they found that a virtual forest was perceived as more or equally restorative as an experience in a real forest, which I think is really fascinating because it's been shown that being out in nature makes you feel better, and it's kind of obvious in a way, but the question is what aspects of that are the thing that makes you feel better. And it turns out just looking at a forest and being in a virtual forest pretty much works just as well. So it's not necessarily the exercise or the air or something magical. It might have something to do with associations or possibly the experience of seeing fractal-like shapes like trees or fractals. So I think that's a really interesting question, like what is it about that experience that is therapeutic on its own? So these are some of the techniques that I use in Visitations. Visual strobing is a big topic, easily worth its own long presentation on its own. Our brains sort of work at different frequencies based on our mental state. For instance, 10 hertz is alpha waves, 10 hertz-ish, and alpha waves are purported to bring about a sense of relaxed attention, whereas 3 hertz delta waves are more associated with deep sleep. The artists Brian Geisen and William Burroughs created a machine called a dream machine. I think that was in the 50s. They took a cylinder with slits cut in it and put it on a turntable, and as it was spinning around, the lights would flicker in their eyes, creating yantra-like visual patterns. There's an app that you can get for your phone right now called Luminate or Luminate. And it actually uses the LED on the back of your phone to strobe lights in your eyes, and they mix that with voiceover meditations. And the idea is that by strobing lights or auditory beats, you can entrain your brainwaves in a way to elicit these desirable states of mind. So if you think about, drumming, putting you in a state, like a trance-like state, that's a positive outcome, potentially, of these techniques. A negative outcome, of course, is epileptic seizures. Cyberpunk 2077, for instance, had this issue where it's like some streamers were having seizures on camera. This sort of came into popular consciousness in the 90s when an episode of Pokemon had very intense strobing and children were falling over and frothing at the mouth. And so there are actually a lot of regulations about what kind of strobing you can have in media, how to avoid giving people seizures, that kind of thing. So with the Visitations that is released on the store, there is strobing, but it's pretty subtle. I didn't want to push that envelope too much, but there are a couple scenes that have more intense strobing. But it is a powerful technique, and it's also sort of questionable, if it needs to be very intense. So even less intense strobing could have an interesting effect. So part of what you will, let's see, did that go to the next one? So part of what you, it didn't switch. Okay. So something that you'll see when you're looking at strobing lights are these patterns on the upper left that were described by a psychologist named Heinrich Kluver. He called them form constants. He was experimenting with mescaline, sort of in a much earlier renaissance of psychedelics in the 20s or the 30s, I believe. So he was taking mescaline and basically describing these visual patterns that he saw. And his suggestion was that these cobweb shapes and these spirals were constituent parts of the structure of our brains, basically, not just of our eyes. And he surmised that because based on where he was looking, the structures were actually part of the space and not just overlaid on his vision. So I would suggest that sort of making use of these shapes kind of taps into some pre-existing structures in our brains, and sort of part of doing that with spirals, with fractals, when you kind of tap into things that are already there, it can be easy to fall into the trap of making things that are a little kitschy or schmaltzy. It's like sort of almost too easy on the eyes sometimes. So I did try to avoid that. I may or may not have succeeded in some places in avoiding the kitsch trap, but it is a powerful technique, I believe. Symmetry is another one. So this is radial symmetry, so kind of feels like a tunnel, but our bodies are symmetrical, natural things are symmetrical, healthy things are symmetrical. We're drawn to them, they're easy. Carl Jung famously used mandalas in order to gain psychological insight and self-understanding. In the same way that spirals just feel right, symmetrical forms do as well. Oops, sorry. Visual artists usually avoid symmetry because it's too easy, but if you're looking to create a comfortable environment, it's pretty perfect. A lot of 360 experiences are designed in such a way that you're invited to look all around in every direction, in front, behind. For myself, I find that to be a little bit stressful, not knowing where to look at, because I always feel like I'm missing something. So, and that's true of even more narrative experiences that I create. But in particular with this study and with patients who are incapacitated in this way, it would be very difficult for them to sit up and turn around behind them to see something that they're missing. So I wanted to not just, create a sense that they're seeing everything that there is to see and not invite them to look around in any way. And I also just wanted to invite them to be very still and to keep their head still and to keep their eyes still. And to accomplish that, all the compositions are very centrally focused, which, if you're working in visual art, it's generally considered to be a big no-no. It's like you want to have more interesting compositions and like kind of a flow of where you're looking. But for if your effort is to create a meditative experience, I believe that giving people a very obvious place to look and keeping it fairly still is a good technique. Scenes and visitations breathe. They're variations in a way that mirrors the shifting sensations and biorhythms of the user. So when you're doing a meditation that involves paying attention to your breath, it's kind of the same. It's like it comes in, it goes out, but the sensations are also changing constantly. So, I made an effort to do things like, change the color of the sky in rhythmic ways where it's like changing back and forth, but also, it included some randomness. So you kind of notice things changing, and it gives a feeling of the experience deepening or unfolding in a way that's different than just scenes that are strictly looping. So if you look at a looping animation, at least for myself, I always notice the loop. And I think the fact that these experiences are always changing a little bit makes for an experience that's a little deeper. So part of the reason that works is because all the scenes are procedurally generated or procedurally modified to some extent, some more than others. Some are very procedural, and some just have subtle effects that are procedural. So typical video game thing, it's like randomizing the cave. Same idea. It's always similar, but a little bit different. Fractals, I talked about a bit. So oral techniques, in addition to strobe lights affecting your brainwaves. Binaural beats is this idea that you can play one tone in one ear and another tone in the other ear, and your brain will actually find a middle tone that creates a kind of wah-wah-wah like beats between them. So if you have a 440 tone and a 450 tone, you're going to wind up with a 10 hertz beat, and that again corresponds to alpha brainwaves. So isochronic beats are similar, but instead of having two pure tones in each ear can hear both of those tones, and the rhythms are a little bit more obvious. So I worked with East Forest, who's an amazing musician. He's Idaho-based and Utah-based. We just did a performance together in Las Vegas, and he specializes in creating musical experiences for people who are doing mushroom ceremonies. So he creates 5-hour-long albums. The music that he releases as albums tend to be very pleasing. The music that he does for ceremonies tend to have a little bit more complexity in their emotions, and sometimes there's a little awkwardness, and sometimes there's, sort of heavier emotions, in part because it's more experimental, but he's also sort of exploring the range of emotions that come up over the course of an experience like that. I also worked with Dr. Deirdre Barrett, who's a researcher at Harvard, and we are actually collaborating right now on a project with HTC about dreams, and she does a dream induction in Visitations, and this is not part of the study, this is the app that we released. And then there's also a body scan meditation. So again, that was more for the home user. The body scan meditation is also procedurally modified. We pre-recorded prompts, and then we randomly play them back in different orders. And then Radha is a partner of East Forest, and she provided a progressive muscle relaxation meditation and a body scan. And for that, we put that together for Healthy Mind Solutions, which is a clinic in Australia, and they were interested in seeing what kind of meditation works better to reduce people's anxiety, whether it's the PMR or the body scan. It seems like studies outside of VR suggest that body scan meditations are more effective. And then a lot of audio is connected to things that you see in the space, so diegetic audio. So as lights are strobing, the audio is strobing as well. So it kind of, enhances your sense of actually being in a place, and they amplify the effects of each other. So the visuals amplify the sound amplifies the visuals. VR is amazing on its own, just as a medium. Something that I have found a little challenging as an artist with VR as a medium is that people are so amazed by the medium, it can be hard for them to provide useful feedback. So you have to work a little harder with people to get the kind of feedback that you want to see if the thing that you're making is actually good and enjoyable, or if they just think VR is amazing. So that's just an ongoing issue because still most people have not used VR or have barely used VR. Some people really don't tolerate VR that well, but for the most part, if you design things properly, the vast majority of people won't get sick and can at least enjoy the experience for the 30 minutes to 1 hour that they're in the experience at the clinic. So VR completely captures your attention. If you're watching a screen, there's always going to be things in the periphery, maybe people in front of you, other things happening, your phone is there, etc., issues like that. So when you're in VR, you're in a completely different place. As far as your brain is concerned, you've left the room and gone somewhere else. And of course, VR isn't just vision. You can connect things to scent and vibroacoustics, temperature, wind, all of that stuff. There is Adam Ghazali is working on a project right now called SenseInc that actually combines all of these things together. And there are a variety of efforts toward creating these fully sensory encompassing pods that include all of these senses as well. So that was one thing that we tried to do with rainbow therapy at the spa, was basically overload all of your senses at once. And by overloading all of your senses, you have an experience that's similar to sensory deprivation. So there's a book called VRX that I would recommend if you're interested in this space. It's a broad overview and it's very entertaining. It covers a lot of research into the therapeutic use of VR. So VR requires onboarding. So this is a big blocker when it comes to getting VR headsets into therapeutic spaces. There's a lot going on at a clinic. The time of nurses and doctors are pretty precious. They don't necessarily have a lot of time to be troubleshooting headsets. You really need to be able to create something where they can just grab it and give it to somebody and have everything be extremely obvious and easy. And that's tricky. I enjoyed using the Oculus Go. I'm sad that they've been discontinued because they were so easy to work with. And this experience was designed to be strictly a 3 degree of freedom experience. It works on the Quest and it works on other headsets, but it doesn't make much use of that 6 degree of freedom. And that 6DoF headset has a lot more going on in terms of setup and tracking and all of that stuff. So yeah, for this kind of experience where it's made for people who are lying down, 3DoF headsets have a huge advantage. So as doctors and clinicians are interested in getting in this space, they need to work with artists. Artists are people that know how to work with narrative, color, sound. It's like we know how to begin an experience and end an experience, all of that kind of stuff. It's like we also have intuitions, like we know how to use ourselves as our first research subject. In medicine and in therapy, it's like ideally you're getting feedback from dozens or hundreds of people. But as an artist, the first person that you have to tap into is yourself. And that's something that we've learned how to do and trained ourselves to do. And it's not necessarily as easy as people who don't have as much experience creating things think that it is. So it's super important that the doctors and the scientists that are the best in the world are also working with artists that are the best in the world in this space, ideally. So these are my main collaborators right now. I mentioned them. This is East Forest, Dr. Barrett. So in addition to use in ketamine-assisted therapy, I am working with another team right now on bringing similar experiences into a space with other medicines, like actually TBD other medicines. It's for a big pharmaceutical company that's developing other kinds of substances, and we are working together right now to figure out how to pair these. Right now, our approach is actually to create experiences for pre and post trip experiences. So there's a question of, whether it's dangerous, like what issues could arise from actually having people inside of a VR experience while they're tripping on mushrooms, let's say. So there's different people have different feelings about that, but in general, there's a sense that it's probably best to try to avoid that, at least for now, and sort of ease into that space by giving people pre- and post-trip experiences. So to get them prepared with a meditation and then to kind of like bring them back down at the end with another experience. In addition to that, I've brought my headset to the dentist, and it makes it so much better. Just like being in another space instead of looking at that dentist light and paying attention to whatever horrible sounds are happening, it reduces pain and it makes the whole thing more enjoyable. So dentistry is a huge and amazing use for VR. Other kinds of infusions, chemotherapy, whatever. So any place where you're sort of forced to be in a place and you'd rather not be there, VR is super helpful for that. And then of course, painful procedures. Teletherapy, I think, could be really interesting, just improving a sense of presence with the therapist that you're working with. Meditation training wheels, again, not everybody, meditating is hard and it's boring, and there's a word that I'm kind of getting into called mindfultainment. So it's kind of entertaining meditations or meditative experiences, and sort of having an experience like that could make it easier to get to the place where you are meditating and sort of orienting your mind the way that you would like to. So I think that is an interesting use for this kind of experience. And then of course, in addition to having the in-clinic experience, being able to take the headset home and revisit that and reinforce it, I think can also potentially, has the potential, it hasn't been studied yet, but I think that could extend the usefulness of ketamine and other things. One thing about ketamine compared to other psychedelics is that the positive benefits tend to only last a week or two or maybe a month. With mushrooms, with acid, people have experiences that change them forever. It's not as much the case with ketamine. So yeah, maybe having the sense memory of being back in VR could help with that too. So this is very much a work in progress slide and kind of, just like a work in progress activity of mine. So it's like creating visitations for the clinic it was a constrained process. There was not much interaction. People were just switching scenes. All of the audio was, ambient and diegetic. People could bring their own music if they wanted to. But creating an app for home users who have lots of different goals and want to do lots of different things is a different thing. So my efforts in that space are a little experimental right now. I have a game that works in Visitations, so it's just a very simple game to just like help you focus on something very simple. So it's basically just like guiding a ball through rings, and the rings get faster and faster. So you are forced to pay enough attention to where you can keep the ball going through the rings. It's very easy, but it does sort of force you to focus in some ways. One thing about meditation or hypnosis is that a lot of this relies on your own internal mental imagery. I tried a VR meditation the other day that was beautiful. Lots of interesting things were happening in it, but the voiceover was telling me to visualize things. So it said it was a chakra meditation, and it was asking me to visualize, it's like a bright, warm red light in my chest, and I'm like, but I'm looking at a blue light right now. So, there was a bit of a disconnect. So if you're doing voiceover meditations and you're asking people to imagine things, you also have to be respectful of the fact that they are looking at something too. So that's kind of the difference between meditative, meditation, mental imagery, things you're actually seeing. So if you're in a situation that's difficult or challenging, being distracted and being forced to look at something is pretty powerful. But if you're trying to learn how to meditate at some point, closed eye meditation or whatever, like focusing on a piece of lint in the corner, I think is probably just as powerful as looking at anything that you could see in VR, really. So some other things I'm interested in is this idea that you could conjure sense memories. So making trippy graphics that look trippy, is that like really what you need to meditate? Not necessarily, but if you use those graphics in a way to conjure up experiences in people that they've had before, is that desirable? Is that helpful? I'm not sure, but interesting subject. Something that I try to avoid is any kind of cultural appropriation, and that includes like New Age cultural appropriation. So I don't use any, what's the word I'm looking for? Sacred geometry, let's say. But that's kind of a question. If somebody responds to sacred geometry and they love sacred geometry, is looking at sacred geometry going to get them to a different place than if they're not looking at it? So that's a question. So flow is something I'm also, it's like if you're a game designer, flow is a really important thing to consider. So my other experience, Cosmic Sugar, is much more in line with the kind of experience that can conjure a sense of flow. Visitations is more of a kind of lean back and pay attention to things and notice things and be open to things. Flow's a little different in that it's asking you for engagement and like getting into something and sort of succeeding at something and gaining a skill and that kind of thing. So which of those is going to be more useful? And I would say probably flow is a little bit more helpful for people who are sober and don't necessarily need to be distracted, but are interested in having an experience to kind of get them to a different place. So novelty is another issue. Like if you're meditating, novelty is undesirable. It's like if you're meditating, you have your shrine or you have your closed eyes or whatever, you're paying attention to what is. If you are creating a mindfultainment experience, then the experience of seeing something new regularly, like new content, is probably going to be the thing that you're going to want to kind of get people into that space of being open to getting into a meditative state of mind. So this, more questions than answers, and like we're figuring all of this stuff out right now. All of this stuff is brand new, and that's part of why I'm really attracted to this space. Is we have this opportunity to create a new kind of visual culture and a new approach to digital shamanism, which I think is really interesting. So some other considerations, 360 video versus real-time graphics, like is looking at a 360 video of a beach that somebody shot, is that as good or is it better than real-time graphics? As a content creator, I would tend to say that real-time graphics are definitely better, but hasn't been studied. So, is a bad video better than like really good real-time graphics or vice versa? And what is good? So there's like kind of a lot of questions there about like what's really gonna work. I like this term, the uncanny valley of photorealism. So it's kind of, if you're familiar with the uncanny valley, it's like the more realistic an industrial robot gets. As an industrial robot goes from a chunk of metal to a fully accurate human, there's a place where they get into the spot of being kind of corpse-like, and it's disturbing to us to see something that's almost human but not quite. So I think the same thing is true with graphics, where it's like, it's almost a beautiful nature scene, but not quite. I wonder how much, as a creator, I see that, and I'm resistant to graphics that aren't quite good, but I wonder if that's also true of people who don't have as much experience actually creating things. Should it be something that's like very easy or challenging? So if it's challenging, it might be more prone to creating a state of flow. If it's easygoing, it might make it easier to meditate. So understanding what your audience wants is a really important part of this. Trying to be realistic again kind of goes back to the uncanny valley. Is it better to try to be realistic and maybe fail, or is it better to lean into a more illustrative approach, which, from the perspective of animating, and budgets, creating something that is illustrative and beautiful can require less production resources than trying to do something that's amazing and photoreal. That top image is from Supernatural. It's a game from Within. If you haven't tried it, they have far and away the best photorealistic VR environments that I've seen, in part because they actually use real photos and do an amazing job of photogrammetry. But the scenes are not very dynamic, and they're very much locked to being in a single position. So to create an experience that's as good as that you can actually move around in, and that changes, gets very expensive very fast. So budgets are always a part of considerations with all of this stuff. So abstract versus figurative, what are people gonna like more? My intuition initially was that abstract imagery was the thing. It turns out that people like natural spaces just as much. It's like kind of 50-50 in my experience, which visitations people like the most. Right now I have 6 natural landscapes and visitations and 6 abstract scenes. I started off making abstract scenes and wanted to test to see if people would like natural scenes more. And I wound up bringing some of the lessons that I learned from the abstract scenes into the natural scenes. So that's like the tunnel-like compositions, the single point of focus, kind of similar techniques can be used to create natural scenes. And they're very illustrative. I did not try to do anything photorealistic. Again, 360 versus 180. Do you want people looking around or not? Do you want to be exploring more, or do you want to be situated in a spot? More questions. So this is some of the stuff I want to do in the future. I want to keep collaborating with people. I want to collaborate with therapists. I want to study the effectiveness, or I want somebody else to study the effectiveness, because it turns out that studying effectiveness is actually incredibly expensive. At a minimum, if you want to take a VR experience and see if it really works and if it actually improves people's mental health, it's like $100,000 to $500,000 to do a study like that. So hopefully somebody will do that. I know that they're in the works, and they also take a long time. So the study that we did is actually not about effectiveness. The study that we did is about preference, which is much easier. So we just wanted to do a survey and show that people tolerated it and liked it. We did do a pre and post depression scale survey, but given the small sample size and the fact that ketamine is such a powerful antidepressant, there's no way that we could really see from that study if it was actually effective, just that people liked it. I want to work with different artists. I want to make a way for people to record their intentions and record their reflections so that they can visit those things after the fact. I'd like to create networked experiences so that therapists can actually create custom experiences for people and share those. That would also allow for, let's say, more junior therapists to guide sessions with material that is made by more experienced therapists. So that's something that East Forest is actually working on right now. He has a startup company called Journey Space, and they're doing networked teletherapy ceremonies. And the idea is to eventually have a lot of music and a lot of materials and resources so that it's easier for people who haven't had all that time to create all of their own content to hop in and lead groups of people through these experiences. Interested in working with different kinds of inputs. So I recently got a HP Reverb Omnicept, which has a heart rate monitor and also can track your eye. And that includes pupil dilation. And from pupil dilation, you can kind of see how activated people are. So I think it's sort of similar to the way galvanic skin response would work. And that's all built right into the headset. So sort of using that to feed back into people's experience. I will say one thing that we tried at the spa just before it shut down, one of the activations that we did was connecting a gong to your heartbeat. And so every time your heart beat, the gong would ring, and it was actually surprisingly stressful. So I'm like very curious to see how like these different feedback devices can work, because right now I'm not sure and I need to do some experimenting myself. So pressure sensing, I've been wanting to, it's like if you think about painful experiences you're going through, you might want to like grip something tightly. So having some kind of grip affect what you're seeing in VR, I think could be really interesting. Like bringing in the voice, there's a company called Entheo Digital, was started by Robin Arnault, and they're doing really interesting work. They have an app called Sound Self, where you can kind of, it feeds back your own voice. I think that having the ability to use your voice as a controller could also be really interesting and helpful in this space, if that would lead to more intuitive controls, that kind of thing. So also really interested in other output devices. So working with dome spaces. There's a place in New York called Frequency that has a dome, and they do sort of live healing sessions in a space like that. So, VR is just a display technology. You can display this content anywhere else as well. It's a little more than just a display technology, but it is a display technology. Custom displays as well is something I'm interested in experimenting with. So, ways to take LEDs and do interesting things with those. The Rainbow Therapy, again, was a set of strobing LEDs that were designed for closed eyes, but I'm very interested in exploring like low resolution LED displays that can incorporate some of these strobing effects. Strobing effects work a lot better and are much more controllable with LEDs. With a display, you're sort of locked into whatever the display rate of the screen is. So you can have frequencies that are aligned with whatever your display is, but nothing really outside of that. And then I'd love to push narrative in a way, but I think that with narratives that would unfold over the course of a series of medicine ceremonies, really the user has to bring their own narrative to it. So there's a question of like, how do you create a narrative that's open enough but also guided, and that's something else I'm interested in exploring. So I added this slide recently. Everybody wants to talk about the metaverse these days. I had a slightly snarkier slide before, but toned it down a bit. The good, if you spend your life in Minecraft or Roblox, and that's a comfortable space for you, it could also be a very comfortable space to get therapy. If you're a kid and you meet up with your therapist and you're like doing Minecraft together, that could be a really positive thing. It could also potentially, increase access in the same way that video conferencing does, but, could potentially embody things a little bit better. So I think that there are some interesting potentials with going from your life in the metaverse to getting your therapy in the metaverse. And obviously the biggest bad thing about it is it's your mental health. It's very sensitive, and having big companies have any kind of access to that stuff could be very dangerous. So that's an important thing to consider. Right now, Light Clinic is working with HTC on a project called Vive Dreaming, and Chapter 1 will hopefully be getting released soon. I'm also working with a company called Cyber, which is a healthcare gaming studio, and they're now part of Atai, which is a very large company that is developing a lot of novel psychedelic compounds. Rocket VR, we're working together to create experiences to help people calm down when they're getting radiation therapy for cancer. And I'm working with Johns Hopkins on experiences for people who are having mushroom trips. So Visitations is currently in use in a few places. It's going to be in use at Penn, and I expect to keep working with it for a long time. This is the studio. I chose the name Light Clinic in part because light was available as a website, and I was like, this sounds cool. The problem is, I didn't think about it at the time. It's like I can't tell people, like if I just write light.clinic, it's not obviously a website. So I don't know if other people know how to deal with that stuff with their domains. But light.clinic is the website. I'll be adding more projects in there as they become available. One downside of working with startups and in the healthcare space is very slow. Startups don't want to sort of share their stuff. So there's actually other startups that are so like stealth that they don't even want me mentioning that I'm working with them. So as soon as I can, I'll be sharing other work from those projects. But they're all, kind of informed by what I learned from doing Visitations. So that, I think time-wise, there's 8 minutes for questions if anybody has any questions.
I'm just going to go right for it. That was great, thank you. What, from your experience and your own understanding of how folks interpret virtual reality, do you think is good for people just in the current marketplace? I'm talking anything from a fully blown action game to the weirdest, just straight up 180-degree video, just anything that's currently out there that you would look at and go, based on my understanding of how people respond to VR in a therapeutic way, that they could get something out of it if they, for example, structured it differently, like Beat Saber as a therapeutic exercise if you put on a custom song or anything of the sort. I was just curious your take on.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because I tend to think that almost anything can be therapeutic. I was going to mention Tetris and Tetris effect, let's say. It's kind of like whatever is therapeutic for you is therapeutic, right? So if you find it relaxing to be in a first-person shooter environment and shooting people, then that's what's therapeutic for you. So I think that different things are just going to work in different ways. So it kind of depends on what are your therapeutic goals and needs. And then I think a lot of it's just a matter of framing. It's like you slow down Beat Saber and it's a Tai Chi experience. But, maybe what you need for your therapy right then is just to distract yourself from like whatever is annoying you at the time. So I think, I guess the short answer is almost anything can be therapeutic for sure.
Hello, I have 2 questions. First one, how can I help this project and is it open for, experiment with it by myself and with friends?
So can you get the app and try it yourself? Is that the question?
Yeah, but also tinker with it as a developer and try it in someone and in myself.
Oh, so to take the code and make some modifications to it?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Okay, come talk to me later. It's not open source, so the code isn't out there. But if there are sort of techniques or tools that you're interested in working with, there are things that I could possibly connect you to.
Okay, that's awesome. And the second question, you have a lot of experience with this, so how can I learn how to make fractals in 3D?
Also a big question.
Sorry.
And there's a lot of answers to that. I actually have been working on a fractal making library for a long time, and it's in kind of a halfway state, but I am hoping to continue developing that, and that would be an open source way to, actually this image right here was developed with that tool, awesome. And it's actually very flexible, and I'm hoping to continue developing that. So that would be one way to do it. But again, if you want to chat later,
okay,
we can talk more about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm wondering if you can expand a bit more on the burn victims. Specifically, you mentioned that the patient reported reduced pain during procedure. However, do you have any information about how much pain was reduced? Did did the surgeons doing the surgery report that it was easier to work with the patient? Did the surgery take less time? I know you don't have all the information, and this wasn't a huge clinical trial, but can you expand a bit more on what your findings were?
So I was not working with burn patients, just to be clear about that.
Okay.
That was a study that Hunter Hoffman did at the University of Washington, and it's very well documented. So yeah, if you just Google Snow World, Hunter Hoffman, you can get all the information there. And it's like, I don't remember all the exact numbers of like, percentage of people that responded really well to it or anything like that, but it was like definitely like statistically very significant, and people enjoyed the experience a lot more and tolerated it very well.
Thank you.
Hi. So VR has like great ability to like make an immersive like environment for patients and players. But one of the biggest downsides of it is obviously the immersion breaking of the physical device. I was wondering if you had any specific strategies you implemented to help combat that effect.
So when you say immersion breaking of the physical device, you mean just having a headset on your head?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's definitely some people just really don't like having a thing on their face, and they find it like sort of upsetting. So, I mean, the key really is just about how you introduce people to it, and just kind of making it a personal experience, like that onboarding experience of that first moment of having the headset put on your head and getting adjusted. If that experience is pleasant, then I think people tolerate it better. It's like they tolerate it less well if you just hand it to them and they put it on and it doesn't fit right. It's like some people will just hold the headset up and they think to themselves like, oh, it's like VR just isn't good because it doesn't fit. So I think that personal connection of the person who's putting the headset on is extremely important. And then, at some point you do just have a thing on your face. So people who are on large amounts of ketamine don't really notice, I think, for the most part, or nobody complained about that in particular. But the Flow device that HTC just came out with is a little bit lighter weight and a little easier to get on. So it's just going to get better and less of a concern. But yeah, there's only so much you can do about the fact that people just have a big thing on their face.
Cool, thank you.
Great talk, very interesting, love it. I'm pretty interested in, there's a comment like learning more about the forest bathing in VR and like how that's going to be equivalent to like real forests. So I'll have to find that article you talked about. But that question made me think of, the previous question made me think of, like, are you thinking about AR and like how to do these types of experiences in AR rather than completely VR, because that might be a little more comfortable?
In my experience, people who work in the XR space are kind of like split in two camps. It's like some people love AR and some people love VR. I love VR because of all of these qualities of being able to block the world out. And it's more about narrative and immersion and that kind of thing. Whereas people who are excited about AR are, I think, very interested in sort of practical uses and stuff like that. So I have considered the idea of working in AR, but it's not a passion area, and I would be more interested if an AR headset manufacturer like funded the development of something. But for this application, the whole idea was to block out the fact that you're in this clinic. So overlaying something on the clinic, I don't think would be quite as powerful for this particular use case.
That's fair, yeah. Thank you.
But so I guess one last point to AR, it's like, I think with teletherapy, that could be really interesting potentially. Mm-hmm. But I think like the tech in general still has a little ways to go.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you.
Thanks.
Amazing presentation, amazing products, thank you. I was just reflecting on how a lot of meditations aim to take you into the body and, more the idea of the mind being fragmented outside of the body. And then the body is a tool for various outcomes. And you talked about how VR, as far as your brain is concerned, you're basically not in your body. So I was wondering if you could talk about maybe that tension, or do you see it as a tension? Do you see VR as applying just to these other types of benefits, or somehow are these compatible?
I definitely think it's a tension, and I think it's a really interesting dynamic to explore. So my approach to sort of that tension between like focus on your body, but you're in this space that's bringing you outside of your body, was to present just very lightweight prompts. Like if you're doing a body scan, it's like all about completely focusing on that part of your body. So the prompts that I have are more about trying to combine focusing on a part of your body and tying that to something out in space. So there's a kind of meditation called open focus meditation, which is kind of, it's kind of a body scan, but it's a body scan that involves imagining spaces between things. So it's like, in those meditations, you'll be asked to like imagine the volume of your finger or the space between your hands and your throat or that kind of thing. So I think there's a way to incorporate elements in the outside with elements in your body. And I think it's really just a matter of fine-tuning that. And I have not fine-tuned that yet. It's an ongoing process. But then there's also the question of, is that a worthwhile or interesting thing to even pursue? And like that's also something I'm not sure about either, because like a body scan meditation is so powerful and you really don't need to be looking at anything for it. So it might just not be a useful thing to have in VR at all, potentially.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, great presentation.
Thank you.
Generally speaking, I have a question around the people who suffer from, post-traumatic syndrome or who went through a war zone. Do you have any, what is your opinion on it and how you see in this technology and helping those who's in need?
Yeah, with PTSD specifically, there's a scientist named Skip Rizzo who's done a lot of work with that over a long period of time. And the idea with PTSD, and I think I'm actually 2 minutes over already. So with PTSD, there's this idea called fear extinction. And something you can do is actually recreate traumatic experiences for people. And by putting them in a safe place and allowing them to re-experiencing something traumatic, like let's say an IED exploding, by your Humvee when you're in Iraq, like that can actually sort of help with reducing symptoms of PTSD. So VR is really powerful for that and really interesting and not something that I am personally exploring at all right now.
Thank you.
Cool. Okay. Thanks, everybody.